All right, well, let's get started. My name is Nick Taylor. I'm the director of the Martha Heasley Cox Center for Steinbeck Studies at San Jose State and the sponsor of this program. The program is also made possible by the College of Humanities and the Arts programming grants and by the Department of English. And I want to welcome you all to the Producing Coco Masterclass for students and the public. The bill was supposed to include two of the people who worked on Coco and then me as the moderator. But one of the members of the Coco team, the producer Darla Anderson, is stuck without power right now and unable to participate tonight. She regrets that she's unable to be here, but our other participant knows her well and can anticipate how she might have answered some of the questions because they've done events like this before. So I want to introduce my colleague, Marcela Davison Avilés, who is a prominent American essayist, independent producer, attorney, and Latino cultural dramaturge and advisor. Marcela serves as lead cultural consultant for Pixar's for several Disney Pixar productions, including Coco, and as a cultural consultant for Amazon Studios and Amblin Entertainment. Her production company, Chapultepec Group, is currently developing several original projects for film, television, and the concert hall. She and I are working together on a concert project. She is a contributing writer for the Mercury News and National Public Radio, and her guest columns and features have been published by CNN, the San Francisco Chronicle, Hip Latina, Modern Latina, the American Banker, and Harvard University's Revista magazine. Marcela is a member of the advisory board of the Center for Steinbeck Studies and the former president and CEO of the Mexican Cultural Heritage Center in East San Jose. And I've asked her to be here today to talk about her participation as lead cultural consultant on the film Coco. Marcela, welcome to San Jose State.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here and to have a conversation about my work on Coco, which is ongoing. And, you know, looking forward to kicking it off.
Thank you. So I think I'm just going to ask you some questions for probably half an hour, 40 minutes to talk through your participation in Coco and to hear some of your ideas about this type of collaboration that happened between you and your colleagues and Pixar to produce this incredible film. And then at the conclusion of our conversation, we'll take questions from the participants. Does that sound okay?
Sounds terrific.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask, first of all, you've done a million different things in your career. I'm in awe of how many hats you have worn. And I wanted to ask, how did you come to start working in film? And then maybe eventually you could get around in your answer to how you came to work with Coco.
Well, that's a good question. And as it happens with so many things in life, the answer is complicated. I received my undergraduate from Harvard College, and at the time, in art history. Harvard didn't have a curriculum in production at all. And so the closest that I could get to trying to gain some sort of understanding of the production process and the industry was to put together a kind of a quasi independent study curriculum, and the most that the closest area of study that Harvard had at the time was the history and philosophy of film, which, you know, anyone in production will tell you doesn't get you anywhere, except to have an understanding, perhaps historically speaking, of storytelling. Nevertheless, that's what I did, and I focused on films from the 1930s and 1940s. So to get yourself on a production track when you have not been in an environment like CalArts or say a formal film program. You know, you can do it a couple of ways. One is to get an entry-level position in a studio environment in Los Angeles. The other is to go to grad school and enroll yourself in a formal film production program. Sometimes professional programs like getting an MBA or getting a law degree can also track you into a career in production. I ended up getting a law degree for, you know, reasons that I won't bore anyone with, but I practiced law for a few years. And eventually, you know, the idea there was to gain an expertise in the practice of law pertaining to production, in whether theater or film or TV, and then from there segue into actual work in production and not as an attorney servicing a production environment. And so, and that's pretty much what I did, except that what I eventually learned is that if you're an entertainment industry attorney, you're still servicing the client, which is the producer, and you're not actually the producer. So I ended up retiring from the practice of law and starting my own production company about 1999, 2000, about 20 years ago, and just literally teaching myself the ropes. And I think what I'll say right here is that if I had to do it again, I would do two things differently. I still might have gotten a law degree because that has been very helpful. You know, contracts are sort of the foundation of everything that happens in our industry. And having a knowledge of how that works is very, very helpful. But I think what I might have done differently is move to Los Angeles, which I didn't do. And I think it is true that if someone is seeking to have a career in the business, notwithstanding where we are with technology and the fact that we've got major players now that are out of Silicon Valley, their studios are in LA, they're not in Cupertino. Or in the Silicon Valley, and I'm referring to Netflix and Amazon and Apple. So really, you know, you have to be where the business is, and for you know, for the entertainment industry coming out of the Hollywood community, you have to be in Los Angeles. So I had my own production company, and I taught myself the process of soup to nuts of what it takes to develop content, to pitch content, to get into development with a buyer such as a studio. I also learned the nuts and bolts at that time of home entertainment distribution, which is entirely different line of business, but it provided some cash flow to the production side of the business, because that's, you know, production is what I might call a long tail activity. You know, you can be pitching projects for a long time, years even, before you might get a green light on a film. It's a shorter time horizon with television pilots, but if you've set up your own independent production company and you're a true independent, that is to say, you're not attached to a studio, unless you have working capital of several $million that will allow you to focus on content development, understanding that you're going to be burning through that capital in order to get to finally a revenue stream. It's going to be very, very difficult as an independent to be developing content without some sort of corresponding revenue stream. So one of the things that I did in order to bring in revenue while I was, and still do, develop my own original projects was consult. And around 2003, 2004, I was approached by the Walt Disney Company to help them with a preschool program, an animated episodic preschool program, which had been greenlit for production. and it was a show called Handy Manny, and it was designed to do storytelling for the preschool viewing audience about the hero in the series is a handyman who's Latino or Latinx, and I was hired to help the creative team gain an understanding of the Latinx community, Latino, Latina, Hispanic community, and to really be sort of the culture whisperer for that team, which at that time, again, going back almost 20 years, there was, except for the actors, there were no Latinos on the production team. I was the only person. And that's how I got my start, really. And the way they found me was sort of circuitous, but not really. When I had started my own production company, we started developing content and pitches, and one of my business partners was in active development with the Walt Disney Company, and so his job was to open the doors with the execs in LA, and my job was to go in there and with him and help pitch the program concepts that we had. So we were able to get in front of, at that time, the people that were making the decisions on pilots and film projects. And except, again, remember, this is 2000, 2001, maybe 1999. No one was doing content targeting the Latinx viewing on, no one. And that was our value proposition at the time.
Right.
So we were really ahead of the curve. My business partner was a very experienced African-American television producer, showrunner. And his idea was to pitch preschool programming for the African-American community. He was partnering with me. I represented the Latinx community, and it was a very interesting couple of years going in to talk to execs at Disney and other brand name companies with that concept. We really didn't get anywhere, and then a couple, 2-3 years passed. I went on to do other things, and the Disney company decided they wanted to move into that area. They remembered me. They tracked me down and hired me to be their consultant. Now, the interesting thing is that they hired me to be the consultant. They didn't hire me to be the producer. They didn't hire me to be the writer, right? So there was still a barrier to entry, but at least I got my foot in the door, and that eventually led me to be hired to work with the creatives on Coco.
On Coco. And what was the story of, I mean, it is kind of as I understand it, a long path from Disney thinking they wanted to do something about Day of the Dead to the Coco that we know now, with a lot of mistakes and left turns along the way. Like, could you give us a sort of short version of how they eventually got it right?
Sure. And again, I can't speak for my colleague, Darla Anderson, who's literally, dodging a tornado as we speak. But I worked with the team for, it's been now almost 9 years. They hired me very early on, which was also something new. And the creative process at Pixar takes many, many years. It takes many years to make a Pixar movie. And it typically starts with in development with folks there at the studio who are directors or emerging directors who are given the opportunity to develop ideas and concepts, and then given the opportunity to, they're given support and funding and a team to develop an idea and then present it to a brain trust there. And then, the projects get selected, and then they commence the process of, researching further, developing the idea further, and getting into a process of writing a script. and the pre-production and production process of animating the film. But that process from beginning to end, you know, I think Coco, I want to say, was a 5 to 6 year project from the idea that Darla Anderson and Lee Unkrich and Harley Jessup and some other folks had. Not, it wasn't Harley, it was Jason, who's on the design team, to create a story, an animated feature film that would be set during Dia de Muertos to the movie that we have today. And there were different iterations of the film. At one point, I mean, if anyone's seen, you know, has the DVD and has seen all of the special content that's on the Coco DVD, you might know that the movie was supposed to be a musical at first. And they did a pivot from that to create a feature film that is set in a world of music, but is not a musical.
Yeah. So you have a lot of experience working in traditional Mexican music through your work with the Mariachi Festival and other projects. Do you want to talk at all about the music on Coco and how they made the decisions to arrive at the various pieces that ended up being put into the film?
Sure. You know, one of the things I like to say about the journey that we all took together on Coco to achieve a cultural authenticity in the story and visually and with the music, is that I think Coco represents one of the first, if not the first, efforts to have what I call community-based filmmaking with a Hollywood budget and Hollywood support. So I did spend 10 years presenting, producing, curating content at the Mexican Heritage Plaza, whether it was with festivals or small gallery shows or mariachi education programs, or trying to support others in the community to come to the center and produce and present content that has to do with Mexico's heritage or Mexican American heritage, Chicano heritage. And at the same time, I was consulting at Disney on their Latinx programming, so that by the time I reached out to Darla Anderson to introduce myself and pitch myself to be hired on the team, I had a grounding, if not a foundation, a deep foundation in Mexican heritage, art, culture, history, cultural anthropology, musical anthropology, the history of Mexican film and music, especially the world of mariachi, because I'd presented festivals I'm still presenting mariachi festivals as part of the portfolio of work that I do. So it was a perfect fit because, you know, Coco is a story about a little boy who dreams of being the world's most famous mariachi. And I was invited to come in early on because of an interesting controversy that occurred around 2013. The Disney company submitted a trademark application to try to trademark the phrase Day of the Dead or Dia de Muertos as intellectual property that they would own. And when that became public, there was it became very controversial in social media, and there was an online protest, and it was a very, very big deal. And at that point, Darla reached out to me to come on board sooner than is typical. Although I would say now, Coco set a precedent so that folks that are trying to do storytelling in film about Mexican heritage or Latino heritage, Latinx heritage projects and topics are now hiring cultural consultants, or what I call culture whisperers like myself, early in the process. Because again, some things have changed and some things haven't changed. You're seeing more representation from our community in the writers' rooms, as producers, as showrunners, sometimes as executive producers, more typically on the streaming projects and less so on projects that are coming out of traditional studios, and less so with feature films, although you'll see representation from Mexico very robustly, but not from the Chicano or Mexican American community. And so typically I will come on board and will round out staffing where the creative team is, say, 3/4 not Latino, or 0 Latino representation on the production side, and me. And so I'm like the only voice in the room that is coming from the community, that speaks the language, whose family is from Mexico. And I should stop and say my personal background is I'm from the border. I'm from Nogales. I'm from Sonora. My mother's from Guadalajara. My father's from Carbo, Sonora. My family's Mexicano going back decades. So that the area of my, the projects that I love to work on, and the area of my sort of expertise is the heritage and culture of Mexico, although I also work often on projects that are more broadly having to do with Latin America and South America, and not specifically tied to Mexico. So my job was to come in early on and help the creatives navigate their journey through that controversy, and then get involved with the production in terms of helping the creative gain a deeper understanding of culture, and this thing, and the idea around cultural appropriation was just coming online. It was a new concept at that time. And so to understand what is that, why do people feel that way? Why do they feel agency in that way? And how is it that the community is claiming agency over culture and identity and storytelling? And how does that impact what somebody in a Hollywood studio wants to do? Yeah. And so that's part of what I do. I also do, I'll read scripts to opine on historical and cultural accuracy, on the accuracy of language. If a producer is seeking to do a project in an indigenous language, then I'm a good connector, and I can bring in experts in Nahuatl, for example, to come and translate if they have a desire to produce a film. So that's a little bit about how I got involved early on with the team at Coco, and some of the sort of the scope of responsibility for my work.
So I have a friend who's on the subject of cultural appropriation. I have a friend who's an African-American novelist, a very successful one. And we were having this conversation one time about cultural appropriation the past couple of years. And I said, well, where do you stand on this? And she said, Nick, you can write about any community you want, including mine, but you better get it right. Mm-hmm. Which brings up the question of authenticity. Mm-hmm. I mean, Coco has been widely praised as succeeding on that front and being extremely culturally sensitive and authentic. In your mind, what are the elements of authenticity in a piece of art like Coco? What are the considerations that someone working on a project like Coco should be thinking about?
Well, I think I break it up in sort of two categories. Because when you look at cultural appropriation, in my mind, cultural appropriation is that someone from outside of a community, say a heritage community, an ethnic community, wants to tell a story either about that community or for that community, and has a desire to illuminate a narrative. But and so, as you said, that's fine. I mean, you know, I don't think anyone really takes, well, some people take issue, but for the most part, even with regard to the American Dirt controversy, you know, the folks that were advocating with regard to that book, they were not saying that Janine Cummings shouldn't write the book. What they were saying, as you said, is she didn't do a good enough job to do it right.
Yeah.
And so cultural appropriation, the definition that I tend to use is someone from outside the community wanting to come in and create a narrative that they're going to monetize. They're going to make money off of it. And if that's the case, then you have the risk of, well, you have, technically it's cultural appropriation. It's not, they're creating a narrative of another culture that's not theirs. They're going to make money off it. That's, you know, that's an appropriation of culture for, you know, financial gain,
Right.
Right? And so then the question is, well, all right, how do you do it right? And there is, there's sort of two ways, in my view. And again, this whole, you know, it's not like you could take a class on cultural appropriation, sort of figure it out, get an A, and, you know, you're an expert.
Right.
You know, we had to kind of invent things as we went along. But one thing I said is, if I decide I'm going to tell a story about Nogales, where I grew up, where I was born, that's not cultural appropriation. I'm telling a story about my heritage, my identity, something that happened to me there. That's distinct from someone who's, you know, Janine Cummings, for example, coming in to try to tell a Borderlands story because she's marginally Latino, Latinx, and, you know, she's not of that community. She had to go and do her research to sort of figure it out. So if that is the case, what's the magic to, quote unquote, getting it right? I think part of it is, yeah, you have to do your homework, as your colleagues said. You have to spend the time, and it could take a long time, to go into community and do your research, but most importantly, go into community and listen. Hear their stories, hear the stories of the community, and try to learn and gain an understanding of, you know, how a community works, so to speak. And oftentimes, one way to do that is to be in the community, spend time there for a long time, not just a week, not just 6 weeks, but, you know, to be immersed in the culture of a community. So for an example I'll give you is that I know many outstanding mariachi musicians who aren't Mexicanos. You know, they're not. They're Anglo, you know, white as white can be. And they're some of the best mariacheros on the planet. But how did they do that? They went to Mexico and they lived there. And they learned the music, and they became apprentices to professional mariachi musicians, and, you know, received their blessing, so to speak. And then they came to the United States and, you know, applied their trade here. So part of the what you need to do it right is to do your homework, go into community, be humble, and really you are there to learn and to listen. And from there, you can start to put together the ingredients of your story. I think the other piece of it is to keep the community with you. So with Coco, what we did was the filmmakers went to Mexico many times. They spent a long time, years in Mexico researching to understand the culture of Dia de Muertos. And then when they came back to the studio to start to put together their screenplay and the architecture of their story, they asked me to help them to keep the community close. So what I did is I created what I call a council of elders of about a dozen preeminent members of the Mexican and Mexican American community to come in and do everything from read scripts, look at animatics, attend screenings, you know, meet with the creatives, and give very candid and transparent feedback on the creative that they were creating. Now, there were guardrails. We set up some guardrails, some rules of the road, which is, you know, we want the impact and the benefit of the wisdom of the community, and we really want to hear whether or not we're getting it right. But there's one director on the movie, and that's Lee Unkrich. And there's, you know, there's a group of screenwriters, and this is who they're, Adrian Molina, he's the co-screenwriter, right? And there's one producer, Darla Anderson. So one of the things that we have to do is to set up guardrails so that people know their roles. And at the same time, that when I say be humble and listen, you know, one of the more prominent members of the community, political cartoonist and activist and a writer named Lalo Alcaraz, was invited to come on board and be my co-consultant. I'd been working on the film for a little over a year. And what Lalo said was he accepted the invitation on the condition that you know, that his notes would be read and, you know, taken into account. Yeah. So that's part of, it doesn't do any good for a studio to bring in the community to provide a sounding board if you're not going to listen to them, because that's, talk about disrespect. And so it used to be, and in fact, there's folks that, well, you know, you don't bring in that, they'll bring in their advisory board late in the game, you know, the script is locked, you're wrapped, the movie's, you know, going to be distributed, and they bring you in to watch the movie, so basically you can rubber stamp it. That is not what happened here. And I was brought in very, very early. Lala was brought in early. We created our council of elders that consisted of some of the most esteemed members of the Mexican American, you know, people like Luis Valdez, the playwright, Herbert Sigüenzas, another esteemed Chicano playwright, folks from Oaxaca, folks from the Altarista community, people who were young, people who were elder, and they really, I think, helped the filmmakers to on their journey, so that Coco really became kind of this intangibly beautiful gem that it is. I think the other aspect of cultural authenticity, and this is also intangible, because you might miss it if you're part of the community, and you might get it if you're not part of the community. And that is to find an element in your story that is sort of the universal human element that will be relevant no matter who you are. Because I think part of cultural authenticity is understanding what is the human element of a story that is illuminating the culture and sort of explicating, translating culture, notions of culture and identity to an audience that may not be familiar with it. And what Lee Unkrich saw right away was that element of Dia de Muertos that is universal, that created its global appeal. Actually, the one factoid I like to toss out is that the movie, I think, made more money in China than it did in the United States.
Wow.
And that universal element was, usually it's in the form of a question with respect to a narrative or a story. And in this case, it was, what would it be like if you could be reunited with someone you had loved and lost? Someone who had passed on to the other side. What would that be like? that's the core element of the film. That is that human question that is asked and re-asked in the storytelling. And that is actually the core of Dia de Muertos, right? Is remembrance, is honoring your antepasados, your ancestors. It's the activity of memory making as a way to hold on to identity and culture. And that's what that story's about. Really, you have a little boy who's saying, I don't want any part of that. I just want to be famous. You know, get me out of here. I just want my guitar, you know? And his family is taking him on a journey that where he has to understand that really to be a great artist, to be a great storyteller, is to be in touch with what makes you human.
Yeah. So we had planned to show a short clip from the movie that you and Darla felt really captures what Pixar did well with this project. So I want to share that very quickly. And we're just going to play, it's about 1.5 minutes, I believe. There we go. Can everybody see that? Okay. All right. Can you tell me why you guys chose that clip?
Well, I think that Darla chose it because she felt that the essence of that clip sort of shows how a Pixar film can illuminate sort of the existential side of being human. You know, you see Miguel and you see the expressions on his face, and his there's no dialogue really. It's him becoming one with his music, and his dream. It becomes expressed, you know, there in that 1 minute and 30 seconds. It's in his face. It's in the way he is, you know, sort of studying what's happening in the television. And on the side of cultural authenticity, setting aside the set decoration there, if he's there in his attic and there's papel picado, and it's his own Dia de Muertos altar. It's his own tribute to Ernesto de la Cruz, you know, the way their depiction of him playing the guitar, his fingers on the frets, that is all, you know, incredibly realistic. And you become lost in that moment with him. And so, so from the standpoint of the human element, it's just excellent filmmaking, for which Pixar is justly famous. But from the standpoint of cultural authenticity, everything in that scene is, you know, spot on. He's watching a film of a famous ranchero singer who is, you know, it was inspired in real life by Jorge Negrete and Pedro Infante. And there's a little sort of tongue-in-cheek reference to the Mexican musicals of the golden era, Siglo de Oro of Mexican film. And they did a very, very good job of mining that moment in Mexican culture. And what we did was to come in and help them calibrate it so that it would be, you know, spot on. And so if you're somebody like me who grew up with that music or actually professionally produces it, you know, we were very proud of that segment. And if you're someone who has absolutely no knowledge of any of that, you're digging it, because who doesn't want to be a fantastic, you know, quasi rock star mariachi musician? And so you're really getting into him playing his guitar and you know, doing it in secret. He's in the attic, he's hiding from his parents. I mean, it's all the fantastic storytelling ingredients that cause you to understand the humanity of the protagonist in the film. And really, I think one of the reasons why we felt that the film got it right from the standpoint of cultural authenticity is there are no stereotypes in this movie. A. B, there's no negative portrayals. Well, you know, Ernesto de la Cruz is the bad guy, but, you know, this was a movie that for once was presenting a story that was a positive portrayal, that was culturally authentic, where one of the writers was Mexicano, where, you know, you have a whole team of us working on it to help them create an authentic depiction of Mexican culture. Everything about Dia de Muertos, they got right. And, you know, it wasn't about the cartels. It wasn't about, you know, a maid in a hotel room falling in love with a rich Anglo guy who's going to save her. You know what I'm saying? All those negative tropes. The Mexican Spitfire falls in love with the, you know, the American airline pilot. That wasn't this. This was a really wonderfully positive story that actually, and you and I talked about this a little bit today, I think, took some of those tropes and flipped them on its head, actually, in ways that I think even folks in the community don't even realize. The depiction of Mama Imelda, for example, a very strong woman. Her husband leaves her. She starts her own business. She's very successful. It was like, you know, girl meets boy, boy leaves girl, girl starts her own business, girl becomes very successful, and girl says, I don't need you, right? That is a very different depiction of a matriarch in Mexican society. And, you know, she was her own version of Maria Felix, if you're familiar with that actress from Mexican movies, but in a different way. And there's one quintessential moment in the movie where she's given her voice and her agency when she sings La Llorona in the film. And that's a moment where I think Coco really has its own feminist moment, where Mama Imelda, you know, commands the screen. She's a fantastic singer. She's literally up on a pedestal. Then she comes down, but she's still high up on the stage. She is singing a serenade. So the concept of the serenade gets turned on its head. And instead of the man singing to the woman who's in the balcony and he's down below, she's up above. The man that she loves is down below. She is singing the serenade to him in order to, you know, be the heroine of the film. So that was another way I thought that the story got it right, which was to celebrate the strength of Mexican women in a way that hadn't been done before.
Great. Okay, so we've started getting some questions on the chat, and I wanted to give a couple to you. So we have a small enough number of participants that I think it would be fine if the questioners wanted to unmute themselves and go ahead and ask the questions themselves. So Flora, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us. This has been so inspiring. And
Great.
my question is, how do you deal with the pressure of having your voice represent a whole culture despite all your years of experience?
Well, that's a really good question. I think, well, I would, you helped to answer it in part. I've been doing this for a long time, and there aren't a lot of us in the industry that do what I do. I think I pretty much know the folks in the business that do. One of them is my business partner. And so part of it is that we come into a project with a certain amount of authority and gravitas. And I think the challenge there is because it can be intimidating to go into a studio environment where you're dealing with, you know, household names, you know, internationally famous, producers and directors and actors. And you have to own your expertise. And, you know, so what I try to do is just understand that I am there for a reason. You know, typically only I know what I know in the room, and that's why I'm there. And so for me to just understand that I'm there to be part of a team, and that there's respect for me, and I of course have respect for my colleagues. And so that's one way to overcome sort of what often can happen in terms of feeling intimidated. And the other is to bring people in with you. You know, I'm working on 2 projects now where I brought in additional colleagues. And so, you know, there's strength in numbers, so to speak. With Coco, we had our advisory board. There's, you know, many people on that, but we ended up having 3 consultants. I was the lead. Lalo Alcaraz was my co-consultant, and Octavio Solis, who's one of the best playwrights on the planet, he was the other consultant. And that's from the standpoint of strategy, that's really good too, because you come at it with 3 different sets of eyes and ears and brains. And oftentimes, you know, we would read a portion of the script, or we'd go into a screening, and each of us would give different notes that taken together really helped the filmmakers. I think you know, there's many things, but the other things I would mention is you really have to know your subject matter. And that's not to say that I have a PhD in anything, although I do have my law degree. But, and if I don't feel that I know something, I never say, I can't do this project. I always say, I'd love to do the project. And then I go and I research the heck out of it, and I become an expert. Or I get people who are experts who have been living in, you know, an area of expertise for 30 years or 20 years. I did that recently. I needed to bring somebody on board on a project who is a linguist. I'm not a linguist, but I know, you know, plenty of people who are, who have their own international reputations as scholars and academics, and I bring them on board. So I never say no to a project unless I feel that for some reason I'm not getting paid what I'm worth, or that there's not a genuine desire on the part of the producer to really try to do it right. And then I can kind of get a sense that it's a fiasco in the making, and I might not attach myself to that project. But those are some of the things I think about.
So next I want to go to Megan Graham and invite any of you who want to ask a question, just drop me a line in the chat. Just say, I want to ask a question, and I'll call on you next. So Megan, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for coming out. My question was, as a student, you don't really have access to, the money to pay for experts, and you don't have necessarily the time to engross yourself in a community for years before working on a film. So if you had a story you wanted to tell, but you didn't necessarily have the time or money to follow that culture and that community, how would you go about telling it, or would you suggest just not telling it at all?
Well, I would, you have a few options. One is you don't tell it at all, which I don't think is, I never like to advise people to not tell a story. Everyone should be free to tell a story. We live in a country where freedom of expression is, at the foundational core of who we are as a democratic republic. So everyone should be free to tell a story. You just have to go in there with your eyes open and understand that if you don't prepare, you get run over, by folks that get really angry about how you tell that story. That's just the era that we live in. And the reason that people are so passionate is because our voices were oppressed and suppressed for generations, right? Through governmental policies like manifest destiny and racial discrimination and, systems that were rigged so that we couldn't tell our stories. Other people were telling our stories in ways that were stereotyped or negative portrayals, drugs, cartels, that sort of thing. And so now, because of social media and because of the internet, the community can claim its agency and will claim its agency over storytelling. And that's just the way it is. American Dirt is a perfect case study. If you're not familiar with that, it's a novel that was just published by Macmillan. The author is a woman named Janine Cummings, and she just ran into a Mack truck because her grandmother's from Puerto Rico, but she identifies, until very recently, she identified as Irish American. And she got a contract to write a book, a Borderlands book, and she did write her Borderlands book. She got paid a 7-figure advance to do it. And the Chicano Borderlands Mexican American community came out and just said, no, you didn't, here are all the things we think in this story you got wrong about our culture. And furthermore, why did you get this contract to tell this story? How come none of us were hired? Because we've been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. Now, to answer your question, how could you do it if you don't have the money, if you don't have the time? I'd say try to spend some time, to understand, try to go travel, go to a library. I mean, that's free. Seek out friends. Set up a little group on Facebook or in some other social media channel where you're just ask questions and ask questions and ask questions. Take a little time. That doesn't cost any money, and the journey that you'll go on will pay off in ways that you can't even imagine. So, with any story, whether you're writing fiction or you're writing a play or you're doing a TV pilot or a script, you do have to spend some time researching, and, it doesn't come just fully formed out of your head and, onto the page. And then I think if you feel that there's something about a heritage community that really fascinates you and you want to try to tell a story, perhaps the way to approach it is to tell the story of your journey within that setting. So the piece of authenticity comes from your journey. you're not necessarily trying to be the expert narrator about, you know, a place in Mexico or South America or China or wherever. You're telling a story that is about your journey, and that's authentic because it comes from you. That's a way to approach it that might help you to navigate these issues relative to who gets to tell a story. And again, what my view is, anyone can tell a story, anyone should tell a story. But we're now living in an era in which held notions of identity and culture are, you know, folks will be claiming their agency over that, and they'll be claiming their agency over how other people do it. Now, you know, back in the day when I was doing mariachi concerts and mariachi festivals, and we were really kind of mixing it up with the curation of some of the shows we were doing, where we were bringing rock and roll artists and mariacheros and son jarocho people and son huasteco people to come and play on the stage. And there were some folks in mariachi community who weren't happy about that. They, you know, they had a different idea creatively about how you should be presenting that genre of music. Mm-hmm. And trust me, you know, if you're a producer, you're going to hear it from someone somewhere along the line. They're not going to like what it is that you do creatively. And so in that instance, you know, there were folks who were not happy and expressed their point of view, and, you know, in a very transparent way. And we had to understand where they were coming from. And so that's always a journey, I think, as a storyteller, you will encounter. And I think that, you know, what I might recommend is for you to Google American Dirt Controversy and read some of the essays that were written by a woman named Miriam Gerba, last name Gurba. Miriam is her first name. David Bowles is another writer who wrote about that. But you know, your screen will explode with all of the essays that were written about what happened with that book. And it'll give you a sense of, you know, the zeitgeist on this whole issue at, you know, circa today.
Thank you.
Brandon Liu has a question. Brandon?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Hey, Brandon.
Yeah.
I absolutely love Coco. Definitely one of my favorite movies. There's so much love and care and detail that goes into it.
Well, thank you.
The question is just about one particular scene that made me a little bit confused. I mean, it was a beautiful scene that led into, but that part where they're underneath the stage at near the end of the movie, where they're chasing after the picture for the ofrenda, Mama Imelda accidentally gets on the pedestal and it's slowly rising up, right?
Mm-hmm.
The speed at which the pedestal was going up was actually rather slow. So I was just wondering, why couldn't she have just hopped off?
Well, that's actually a creative question that Adrian or Darla or Lee would best. I actually honestly don't know the answer to that. But I'm happy to share the question with them and send an answer back to Nick.
I know how to reach you, Brandon. So we'll get you an answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yisel, do you have a question?
Yeah. Thanks so much for doing the presentation. I know everything's crazy right now, so glad that you took the time to
I'm glad that you're enjoying it and that you're participating.
I'm Mexican myself, and I really appreciated that Coco was able to bring a lot of cultural aspects of Mexico to light in the animation field specifically. My question is, for representation in the media becoming more present, would having a character just be Mexican or have a specific ethnicity, background, and identity, but not have it pertain to the story just be as equal in representation, even if it's not their whole aspect of their character's journey?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think the issue of representation in the industry right now is there's different ways that you can get at it. And one is that you create a story about the community that is told by the community, and it is for the community, about, by, and for. So it's like the triple whammy, you know, we're the author, we're the technicians, and the story itself is about us. But you can have a story that has nothing to do with us, you know, in which our community is present in the writer's room, or is present with respect to the senior creative team, or on the producing side, and that there you get representation. And I would say that you know, right now there's not enough of either in the community. They're very low representation in the writer's room, very low representation in terms of screenplays that get greenlit, extremely low representation on the part of producers. And we're doing better with respect to directors. You know, you have folks, los tres grandes from Mexico who have all won Academy Awards now. But really, you know, you don't have, when was the last time a Chicano director, producer was nominated for an Academy Award? You know, I can't think of the last time it happened. Now there's representation in terms of talent, for sure. And you're starting to see gains. There's Tania Saracho, who's the showrunner producer for Vida, and other, you know, excellent examples. But I would say that we need to have representation across the board. And, you know, we shouldn't be pigeonholed into, we're only going to be hired to tell a story about, you know, borderlands topics, right? So we don't want to be pigeonholed either. And so I think that in terms of cultural authenticity in storytelling, well then, yeah, you know, that presupposes that the story is about an ethnic community or heritage community, that you have to, you know, you have to get it right, right? It demands that there be authenticity in the telling of it, unless, you know, you can have something, for example, I'll give another example, Jorge Gutierrez, brilliant director of animated features. He wrote and directed The Book of Life, which was the Day of Dead movie before Coco came out. And, you know, his take on Day of the Dead is very, you know, it's Jorge, you know, it's not very authentic, right? It's his, you know, his own magical realism telling of a kind of Romeo and Juliet type of story set in the land of the dead. And he creatively, he took many liberties in telling that story. But he's Mexicano, and, you know, he decided he's of the community. There's no quote unquote cultural appropriation happening. By definition, he's telling a story. He's Mexicano. He can tell it however he wants to tell it. It's very different than, you know, someone who's not from the community wanting to do that and getting it completely wrong. And then the other side of it is just representation in the industry. And that's, you know, it's going to be a long time before that happens. I think you guys are the next generation of where it can occur. And there's no one way of getting access into the industry, except, again, I'll go back to, if folks want to work in the industry, they need to go to Los Angeles, for sure. And then there's different ways. You can get a job as a stringer on a show. You can get into an internship program. You can, you know, go to grad school and get into a pipeline for a specific area, whether it's directing, producing, learn how, you know, that's where you learn the mechanics. We haven't really talked about the mechanics of filmmaking, directing, or the mechanics of, you know, what a producer does. But that's, you can still, it's an industry where some aspects you can still learn on the job, and some aspects you're going to need that are so technical, like show running, you know, actually producing episodic TV is there's a technical expertise that you need. And the only way you're going to learn it is you either get hired to be a PA and you learn it on the job, or you go to film school or TV school and you learn it that way. And then there's a pipeline that you can get kind of pushed into through your school.
Great. Anyone else have questions?
I think Flora.
Sure, Flora has another one. Go ahead.
Hello. Kind of going off of what you just said, how do you draw the line as a Latinx individual creating your own work between your artistic vision and then being culturally accurate? How do you decide or draw the line between what's your artistic kind of creativity, especially if it's a fantasy world, but still maintaining that cultural accuracy to your own background?
Right. Well, that's a really good question, and that's actually something that I talk about with my colleagues when I get brought onto a project. That's the first thing I actually address, which is what I say to them is, I understand that I have a job to do, and part of my job is to not do your job. You know, I am not here to be the director. I am not here to be the writer. I know what the guardrails are, and you know, I'm going to assure you, Mr. Director or Ms. Director, that I'm going to swim in my lane so that you can swim in your lane successfully. But in order for you to do your job, you need me to help you understand the nuances of culture. And you know, part of what I do is yes, to help folks today who are not Mexicano to understand Mexicanidad, you know, that whole, you know, you can sit there and talk about it with, you know, having a glass of wine for decades, right? And you still aren't going to, here, go read Octavio Paz, Labyrinth and Solitude, and you'll understand Mexicanidad, right? No, you know, well, that's part of it. But the other part of it is to help filmmakers and creatives and producers and marketing departments and public relations people, because I work for all of those folks on a given project, to understand the zeitgeist, to understand what's happening in the community, why people feel the way they feel, and why today, in a way that, well, it's always been this way, but it hasn't been out there the way it is now. Culture is identity. You know, culture is identity. And people are claiming their culture as their identity. They feel really passionate about it. And there's a lot of reasons for why that is, you know. And sometimes I'll end up having, you know, long discourses about the Mexican-American War in 1846, right? You know, and explaining why people say the border didn't cross us, you know, we didn't cross the border crossed us. That goes into this idea of claiming agency, and why folks out there, when they see a film like Coco and they identify with it and it's relevant to them, is because there's a feeling that finally someone is validating in a positive way, in an accurate way, a held notion of identity. And you can't put a price tag on that. That's when you know, you hit the ball out of the park when you can achieve that. So I think that there's the zeitgeist of it, you know, what's happening in the zeitgeist. And that's all about, you know, social justice and politics and pop culture and what's happening in music and what's happening in social media, you know, what's happening in the zeitgeist of the culture. And then what's the storytelling process. And if you're so involved in the storytelling process that you have no clue what's happening in the zeitgeist, inevitably there will be a clash, and then a story will be produced and distributed, and it will not, there's something happening in the zeitgeist that causes the community to react in a certain way. Like, for example, Coco, when we started Coco, nobody could have imagined that the 2016 presidential election would have ended up the way it did, but it did. And the movie was released right after that happened. So the zeitgeist went from here, you know, from over here to over here in the span of 3 years. And it was incumbent upon us to really take a step back and say, okay, wow, something's really happening with the narrative, the Latinx narrative, Mexican narrative in popular culture. It's being hijacked by folks over here in Washington, D.C. in a way that's bad. And we have our movie coming out. What is our responsibility as a storyteller to get it right? And I can tell you that people felt, wow, the responsibility in our shoulders, we really felt that we had almost a sacred responsibility to get it right, because we knew that we were really kind of the only balance to what was happening in terms of the narrative, the national narrative about the community. So there's disparate ways you can approach that, whether it's the storytelling, but really I'm there to be a consultant. If they hire me to be a writer, then I will opine on the creative, for sure. But typically, if I'm hired to be a consultant, what I'll do is I'll say, if you tell the story this way, Mr. Producer, I'm here to have your back so you don't get run over by a Mack truck if you tell the story the right way. But I'm not here to do your job. So I'll tell you, if you tell the story this way, or this way, or this way, I think, in my professional opinion, the reaction could be this, A, B, or C. I can't guarantee what the reaction is going to be, but I want you to go into it with your eyes open. And you can make the creative decision however you want, because you're the storyteller and I'm not. But if you do it this way, I can tell you that probably people will be really pleased. And if you do it this way, embracing a negative trope all over again, you're going to run into some issues. But I'm not the storyteller, I'm the consultant. You now have all the information I think you need to approach the storytelling process and, have at it.
So we have time for one more question. Ulysses, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I also love Coco, and I think it's awesome to hear that it did really well in China. That's something that I wasn't aware of. I was just curious, are you concerned that many people who possibly didn't know about Mexican culture will now associate things like Day of the Dead as a Pixar franchise? Because from my personal experience, I've heard people be like, oh, it's Coco themed when referring to like the Day of the Dead.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and absolutely, that was something we talked about all the time, which was Dia de Muertos is the national patrimony of Mexico. It's a Mexican heritage tradition. It is, UNESCO has designated it a World Heritage tradition, and nobody owns it except for the Mexican people. And you can't. So the way to approach a story is to try to be authentically true to the, it's like nobody owns Christmas, right? You can't, or nobody owns a religious tradition like, say, Hanukkah or Easter. Those are sacred traditions that are, go back millennia. And there's a fine line between that and, say, characters that are created by Disney that Disney owns, like the character of Miguel. That's a Disney character. That's their IP. They own him, and they're telling a story about him that's set in a historical or heritage context. And so part of our job was to always make sure that everyone, and we didn't have a hard time. Everyone's like, of course, this is why you're here, is we want to make sure that if we're getting too close to, and that's where the work that I do in merchandising is that part of the content business. That's the business, right? Where they make the toys and the apparel and the posters and things like that. And so part of what we did was to say, you know, we set up guardrails where we said, you know, we're telling you, you know, if you want to try to monetize Day of the Dead, you know, go ahead. We can't stop you, but if you do, you know, it's going to be very controversial. It could be very, very negative public relations. It could even impact your stock price. So, you know, there's reasons having to do with cultural integrity and morality that where you should not do it. And there's business reasons why you should not do it. So the guardrails that we set up was that the merchandising would be only for original characters that were created by the Disney people. Like you can get a Ernesto de la Cruz bauble doll, right? But you can't get a Day of the Dead cempasúchil kit to make your own altar, right? You can't do that. Although in Mexico, you probably could, right? But in Mexico is Mexico, you know, that Disney cannot monetize a sacred tradition. That's what we said. You don't do it, don't try it. And they're like, we don't. We don't want to do that. But look, we created this really cool guitar with a skull on it. And, you know, what do you think about that? And I'm like, well, you know, people have been merchandising guitars for forever. I don't have an issue with you guys creating a Miguel or an Ernesto de la Cruz guitar. And so that is how we approached it with Coco in terms of trying to create very strong guardrails or rules in which you couldn't cross into an area that was inappropriate culturally. But if they didn't, you know, people don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And so if they don't hire folks like us, they're not going to know. And so then, you know, then they go ahead and do it. And typically what will happen is folks who are not from the community, to your point, will say, oh, this is really cool. Day of the Dead, that's a Disney invention. No, right? So you do as much as you can. But once you have a huge mega conglomerate, so then you're weighing, well, what's the benefit? The benefit for a $250 million movie to be portraying Mexican culture in a super positive way, you know, yeah, we'll work on that, and we'll try to help them get it done right.
Awesome, thank you.
Excellent question.
Well, thank you so much, Marcela, for speaking with us this evening, and thanks to all of you who connected tonight with this event. Brandon will try to get an answer for you about why Mama Imelda rose so slowly on that pedestal.
Yeah, I'll send that email out tomorrow.
Yeah. And everybody be safe out there, and hopefully we'll connect again like this with more interesting programming. Thanks again, Marcela.
Thank you guys. Thank you,
Good
Nick.
night.
Good night.